And we're live.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our third session in our Learning for Collective Action series on dyslexia. Today, I have some amazing discussants with me, and I'm going to introduce them in just a second. But I'm so excited to have you here. As a reminder, if you have seen me before in the previous sessions, or maybe you don't know who I am, my name is Amber Gustafson. I use she, her pronouns, and I work at 313 Reads in policy and digital engagement. You can go ahead and put in the comments, kind of as we move through this beginning section, your name, an organization that you may work for that has prompted you to want to be here with us today. We would love to see all of that love in those comments and be so excited for our panelists today. So we're going to go ahead and I'm going to go through some brief thank yous and introductions as I'm waiting for those wonderful comments. Today, our policy discussion is titled Dyslexia Policy, specifically Michigan, and what it could mean for our children and schools. So yes, we are going to be talking about what is this dyslexia policy that's happening right now in Michigan, and really what's the connection to Detroit? What's the connection to our kids? What's the connection to our schools, parents, families, caregivers, all of that great, great stuff. First, we would love to thank the Skillman Foundation, TFA Detroit, and specifically TFA Detroit's Michigan Education Policy Fellowship for their support in making this entire thing possible, both today's session and the entire series. Very much appreciative for their support. Thank you. Here's a little bit more about me if you're really curious to read. You definitely do not have to. But I've been working with 313 Reads since September of last year through that policy fellowship with Teach for America Detroit. Prior to that, I was a high school English literacy, English as a second or other language teacher for 5 years. So very excited to move into a different space to hopefully have kind of a larger impact with 313 Reads Collective Impact Coalition. So excited to be here. I'm going to pass it over to my co-facilitator, Elise, to introduce herself and a little bit about her journey.
Hi, my name is Elise Hartman, and I'm the Director of Collective Learning and Resources at 313 Reads. I've been with 313 Reads since June, and my previous role was as the Director of Education at MAC Development. I'm also the founder and CEO of Nesting Birds Publishing and the proud owner of a bookmobile, Birdie's Bookmobile. So I'm happy to be here today and excited to have this discussion and hope that you all leave with information that you can implement in your practices.
Thank you so much, Elise. So excited to be co-facilitating with you today. All right, we are going to model, just like we have in previous sessions, if you've been with us, a practice that we take very seriously here at 313 Reads, and we want to share that with you all. So it is something called a restorative check-in. We do this at the beginning of every meeting that we have, and it really is to take a moment for us all to kind of be on the same playing field and check in with ourselves about a question that can be silly, that can be serious. Today, it's a little bit more serious in that we would really love to know what is your motivating factor to work for literacy equity. I'm going to go ahead and start, and then I'm going to popcorn to someone else on our panel. I know I haven't introduced you yet, but hopefully this can kind of show the way that we do this in meetings. And for everyone in our audience as well, we would love it if you would put that in the chat. So for me, what motivates me to work for literacy equity is my time in the classroom and seeing my students. I mentioned earlier that I worked at the high school level. Oftentimes people think that, you know what, you're at high school level 14, 15, 16, 17. If you haven't learned to read by now, like it's not going to happen, right? I obviously did not take that stance with my students, and we worked as hard as we could. And I also knew that at that age, it was definitely working harder to get them caught up rather than maybe some education or interventions that could have happened earlier in their lives and earlier in their educational careers. So for me, seeing students, knowing where they could be if they had much more support from the system and from their schooling would have been so, so helpful. And that really motivates me every day to work for literacy equity. I'm going to go ahead and pass it to my co-facilitator, Elise. What motivates you to work for literacy equity?
Yeah, I think having been boots on the ground since 2011, and like you, being in a classroom and working with students and seeing libraries and schools that are in such disarray, and the fact that so many students have little access to books, and we look around and our libraries aren't necessarily accessible. booksellers aren't accessible. And I just look at Detroit and see us as this book desert and the great potential that students have if they have access to these books, if we can get books into the hands and into the homes of children and families in our communities. So that is why I am motivated to work for literacy equity. I am going to turn it over to Brian Love.
Thank you so much. First, it's a pleasure to be here. My name is Brian Love. I'm Director of Community Outreach and Partnerships at the Education Trust Midwest. I really hope you all cannot hear my neighbor mowing the lawn next door through my closed windows, which I'm really stressing about right now because he hasn't cut his lawn in a whole month and he picked today of all times to do it. But here in partnership with not just 313 Reads, but all of the other panelists here today is actually kind of a reunion when it comes to the dyslexia work and policy. So I've had the privilege of working with Brian Gutman, Susan Ward Schmidt, and Jametta Lilly on advocating for Michigan's children, particularly on this issue of dyslexia. So definitely interested in today's conversation.
Brian, could you pass it along to someone else, one of our other discussants?
I will pass it along to my friend, Susan Ward Schmidt.
Hello, everyone. The motivation started in 1979 when I started in a classroom fresh out of college working with learning disabled students, and has followed me throughout my career working with students with learning disabilities from kindergarten all the way through working with adults in a community college setting, taking remedial reading. It's so clear to me, and a lot of those years were in an urban setting. It's so clear to me that if you are not literate and you don't command the ability to read and write effectively, it will change the whole trajectory of your life. So that's what drives me, and I continue the work. So I've been a teacher. I helped work putting together the legislation, and I'm very involved in this space. So glad to be here. Oh, got to give it to somebody. Brian Gutman. I'd follow the directions.
Thank you. And thanks all for being here. I'll save my intro for a little bit later. This is really personal to me. I was a kid who struggled to read, and fortunately had a teacher who wasn't my teacher early on in elementary recognize that while it wasn't dyslexia, I wasn't reading the way that reading was being taught. And she worked with me for 3 years, including over summers and outside of school hours, to overcome that barrier. And it was life-changing. I had the benefit of somebody picking up on that. I had the benefit of parents recognizing that I wasn't learning to read the way that my siblings had learned to read. And so this to me is just so fundamental. We've got such high rates where we know children have this need, and we don't have the training and the structures in place to make sure that every child is actually receiving the level of support that they're needing, so that they can overcome that literacy barrier that leads to all sorts of forms of disengagement and societal challenge that Susan just referenced. So thanks for having me, and I'm excited for the conversation. Amber, I think I'm going to pass it back to you.
Thank you very, very much. Fantastic. Thank you all so much for participating in our restorative check-in. And now we are going to move into a reminder that you, as an audience member, can win a free copy of Dyslexia Advocate. You do need to go to this tiny URL, tinyurl.com/LFCA series 2 in order to register. I'm going to pull all of those registrants' names kind of towards the end of this session, and I'm going to enter those into a little raffle, and we'll see who gets to win it. So reminder, if you are interested in Dyslexia Advocate, please, please, please make sure that you register at this link. All right, I'm going to pass it over to Elise to give a little bit of framing about our series as a whole before we dive into introducing our discussants today.
And today is our third installment of our series on dyslexia. So we are talking about dyslexia policy and what it can mean for your children or for our children in schools. Our two previous sessions live on our Facebook page, and I think we might be able to drop that into the chat so that you all can go back and watch those if you did not participate or haven't seen them. And then we have two more sessions that are upcoming in the series, and we will be sending some more information out about that shortly. So keep your eyes open for that information. And we are hoping that today that you do leave with some information that, as I said earlier, you could share with your colleagues and you can take back to implement in your practices, so that we are hoping that we are providing some learning opportunities that are accessible for our community members, and that you do have some wonderful takeaways from these sessions today, or this session today. So we hope that you do have information that is usable, that is accessible, and feel free to ask some questions, drop your comments into the comment section in the chat, and we will try to answer those in your questions in real time as we proceed with the series. So welcome, and I think we are ready to move forward and get started.
Awesome. So I would love to take a second and have our panelists introduce themselves the best way that they see fit. I have a little bit of a bio up here. You can read that if you'd like, or you can just kind of chat through what brings you here today for this session on dyslexia policy. So we're going to go in last name alphabetical order. Mr. Brian Gutman, can you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, great. Well, I really appreciate, again, being here. I think I've introduced myself and my rationale for being here already. But I'm the Director of Government Relations at Learning Care Group. We're the second largest provider of private early childhood education in North America, with 1,051 locations in 39 states and DC. And in my role, I'm really working as the senior policy expert on federal and state policy issues, working with legislative bodies across the country to try and expand access and affordability to that critical care, starting at 6 weeks old and going up to about 12 years old. I come to this work through the Education Trust Midwest, where I spent almost a decade working on a range of issues, including extensive work on early literacy. In the last couple of years, the dyslexia bill package with Susan and Brian and others, Brian Lovett and others. And earlier than that, getting some quick wins that really, I think, recognize dyslexia as an area needing far greater focus and attention through the budget, but not yet getting to where we needed to go. So some of that early legislative, some of those early legislative steps to make sure that dyslexia was a front and center focus for the state of Michigan.
Fantastic. Thank you, Brian. Brian G., Mr. Gutman. We are going to go ahead and move to Mr. Love. Mr. Brian Love, can you please introduce yourself?
Yes, ma'am. So once again, Brian Love, Director of Community Outreach and Partnerships at the Education Trust Midwest. I will go more into, my personal, but also professional reasons for being here today. I was moved by Brian. I knew Brian Gutman's story of, his childhood and challenges and how he's overcome them, which I know he has, because I know he's like an avid reader now. So definitely hard work and support from educators and parents and family. Definitely that combination of lifting up powerful voices to support our children in the classroom is what helps improve our children's lives and helps make them better students. Had a similar issue with my son in elementary school, although not dyslexia. He was diagnosed with ADHD, but because of the thoroughness of his homeroom teacher and trying to help us figure out what was going on with him, which was driving, as a number of you parents would know, that can really drive you crazy. Her, commitment to helping him and helping us helped us figure out, one, getting him diagnosed, but also helping him get the support he needed, and also help us get the support we needed to support him. And so I think that's what really motivates me in this work. In my career, I think I've been in education advocacy probably as long as I know Jametta Lilly will be introduced shortly. with Detroit Parent Network. I've probably been active just as long as I've been an active member of Detroit Parent Network, going on, wow, close to 20 years now. Actually, it is 20 years now. So, it does it shows that, the commitment is a long and hard commitment, but also a lot of hard work. And so, making change does not happen overnight. It takes a long commitment, but also takes a lot of teamwork. And, I'm very happy and proud to work with all of the panelists here, because that work is so important. And you can't get this done without teamwork. And I'm sure I'll talk more about that later during the panel discussion.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Brian. We would love to move into introducing Susan. If you would like to introduce yourself for our next dyslexia series session.
So I mentioned earlier that I've been teaching school for many, many years. And I think the defining thing for me, that once I retired in 2019 to reach out to the legislature and to get the ball rolling on really doing substantive legislation. I taught for about 7 years. I came out of a Big Ten school, had a degree in elementary ed and a master's that had learning disabilities and special ed in it. And for those 7 years, I did everything I was told to do, and I wasn't able to reach a lot of my students. And I happened upon, by luck, finding out about the Michigan Dyslexia Institute and taking intensive training there. And it changed everything. It changed my life. It changed my students' lives. And through my career, working with colleagues that would come to me and ask me questions, and thinking, everybody needs this training. We need to all be on the same page so we know how to help our children. And it wasn't just our special ed population, but there are ways to teach reading that are going to help all kids. We can do a better job. And now, of course, the cognitive science has moved so rapidly to show us, brain scans and all kinds of things that support the kind of work that is in this legislation and what we're working towards. So I'm driven to think that all teachers, all educators will be empowered with this, and that more children will learn to read, and we'll have fewer kids feeling like they give up on themselves. So that's sort of my story, and that's why I continue to be involved in this. And like Brian said, it is trying to move legislation. I was like moving a barge with a ping pong ball, and it is a hard job, but we've had such great team members, and I hope we can bring it across the finish line before this session is over.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Susan. I'm going to go ahead and welcome our wonderful panelist to introduce herself, Miss Jametta Lilly. Oh, you're on mute, Jametta.
Oh. Okay, hopefully you can hear me now.
Yes, perfect.
Thank you, and it's such a delight and an honor to be part of this discussion. My name is Jametta Lilly, and I'm blessed to serve as the CEO of the Detroit Parent Network. And just very briefly want to echo the kinds of things that I know all of us are about, is that how can we begin to converge, particularly for parents, the importance of improving not only services to our children, and particularly those with dyslexia and other special abilities and needs, but how do we move policy to sustain the change that we're interested in? And so with DPN, we're delighted to be part of this conversation. We've been empowering parents with this information, and know that I like that analogy about the ping pong ball, having worked in policy, both in behavioral health, education, as well as in primary health. We're moving a super tanker, but I'm delighted to be part of this conversation, and DPN is absolutely committed to being a partner that makes sure that all of our children, especially those with special needs, are getting equitable resources.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jametta. Thank you, Susan and Brian Gutman and Brian Love. Really appreciate your time here. We are going to go ahead and dive right in. We also want to make this very clear up front. This is just kind of a conversation. Where the conversation takes us, whatever pops in, all of the questions are to all of you. So whoever has something that they would love to say, you all mentioned that you all pretty much know each other. So I hope that this will be totally okay and very smooth. I appreciate all of your expertise. Let's go ahead and dive in. So our first question is, how does policy move educational equity forward, right? So we hear a lot about this is what we need to do in classrooms. What is that kind of top level idea? Why is policy important to consider?
So I guess I'll take the first shot, and then I think Susan and Brian will probably chime in. So at a high level, I would say, policy, I think a lot of folks, parents, folks in the community, we struggle with the government, right? We struggle with our legislatures, we struggle with politicians, but politicians actually pass legislation that literally affect our lives. Legislation actually affects people being able to live, grow, and breathe in our world. And so, one of the things that strikes me that's very important is, we have in our state, we have term limits. And so, by the time you have a legislator who comes in the state house, they're able to run for 3 2-year terms. In the state Senate, in the other chamber, they have opportunity to serve for 2 4-year terms. So most legislators or most elected start out in the state house. And by the time they actually know and understand what their role and job is as policymakers, they're usually termed out after that 3rd and final term. And then you're dealing with a new legislator. So, and then the turnover can be even greater than every 6 years. And so really it's about educating us, not just us on the line here today, but parents, educators, to be able to go and advocate and talk to those legislators and educate them on, what the issue truly is and how do we solve that issue for children. Any other thoughts?
I want to, if I can, give an example. So we know that in elementary school, it's good for children to have specials like art, music, gym, etc. My kids went to East Lansing schools. I was a teacher in Lansing schools. The money was flowing in East Lansing schools and not as much in Lansing schools. Very unequitable. So my kids in East Lansing had gym 3 times a week, art 2 times a week, all that. My students that I was teaching at Rio Elementary in Lansing, they got art once every 2 weeks. So if policies aren't passed that require this, and of course funding has to go with the policies, but then things don't happen for all kids. So I think it's a perfect example with, we see a handbook that's just come out, a dyslexia handbook that just hit the public. It's a great handbook. It's only through policy that we pass to codify this into law that then it's required. And we see all schools do it for all kids. So I think that step of policy making at that level is absolutely necessary.
Yeah, I would go ahead, Jametta. I'm sorry.
Okay. No, you go ahead, and then I think my tag will be pretty good after what you might say.
I was just going to say, and this is, I think, really building off what Susan just mentioned. This is about taking what works from a micro level, a classroom level, where we know there are talented teachers that have robust skills in this area that are able to support students that have dyslexia or might benefit from learning in a similar manner, to the macro level. What do we do for that child next year when they have a different teacher who might not have that training and experience? What do we do for the child down the hall? What do we do for the child in a neighboring district? We can't solve everything with policy. Certainly passing a great law and fully funding it and providing robust training is only half the battle. It still has to be implemented well. That robust training has to be quality. It has to reach teachers at the right time, in the right ways, and provide ongoing support. But it's the starting point. It's how do we really begin to change the system fundamentally? So it's not a matter of luck. Are you districted into the district with the resources? Did you happen to get the teacher that has vast experience in this? But instead we make it the norm.
Yeah, I really so appreciate you breaking out, and you brought up that element of implementation. And I think in our discussion, when we talk about change and we talk about policy, we have to be mindful that, as many of us know that are in this Zoom, is that there's policy that's moved at that legislative level, of which, that Ed Trust has been, such a remarkable partner in moving equitable policies with legislation. And then also, you mentioned, Susan, the importance of it then at the policy level, at the district, and even at the school level. So I think as we talk to our parents, that we need to help inform them that, in fact, there can be different strategies and different methods that we push for understanding, implementing, and holding people accountable at all three of those levels. And I think that's what kind of confuses not just parents, but just everyday folks, that there's policy that we have to push legislatively, but there's so much that can be done at the departmental level, whether it's an intermediate school district, the school board, or even down to, in some cases, how principals are implementing or perhaps not implementing the intention of the legislation. So it really means that we have to be really mindful and I think strategic on all three of those levels.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much for that amazing first question. I really wanted to say quickly, Brian Gutman, what you said about kind of the policy and the implementation also reminded me of, policy is really a way for us to like codify and keep institutional knowledge, right? Like we can have amazing teachers that if they go to a different district or a different school, there may be some variability within that, but having a state level policy means that across the state, we are saying like, this is the standard that we all need to be meeting. So I think that that's really powerful too. What are some important strategies to consider in terms of like equity work through policy? So again, not implementation, but policy. What strategies would you consider to be important?
So I think when you're first you have to, as you're developing strategy, I think is an important thing to actually understand who you need to talk to, like targeting your legislators and knowing what makes them tick. So for instance, the current Senate bills that passed earlier this year, those bills passed by a very, I'd say, I'm probably saying this improperly, but a very bipartisan group of legislators who probably have never agreed on anything on the Senate Education Committee together, but they came together. The Republicans typically very conservative, the Democrats on this committee typically very liberal, but they came together to support legislation to improve dyslexia together and pass those bills rather quick in a very short session. And so, but leading up to that, it was important to know exactly what you're saying when you're saying it to a particular legislator. I'll use one legislator. I won't use him by name, but one of the conservative legislators, he actually has a history with dyslexia. He also is a big fan of phonics. And, just knowing and understanding that, that helps you lay out the groundwork for your communication on educating him on how this policy is important in improving the lives and outcomes for Michigan's children.
I think thank you, Brian. I think this is a great question. And Brian, you're absolutely right. Three somewhat disjointed thoughts. I think when making effective policy and equitable policy, first and foremost, involving the people that we're talking about in the policymaking process is critical. That in this case is parents and students. It's policymakers, it's researchers. It needs to be something done with one another and not to someone. And I think the best way to overcome inequity in the policymaking process is just that. The second thing I would note is making sure that we're legislating around fact and not opinion. Too often it's the other way around. I think Susan really did an exceptional job in making sure that the foundation of this legislation was taking the experiences lived and matching it with best practice and research into what works. How do we change the experiences, the negative experiences lived? The last piece I would just mention is that this is a complex issue. for a wide variety of reasons that we don't need to go into right now and today. And I think when we have these really complex issues, it's important to think about policy as a layer cake. We want the beautiful, frosted, delicious end product. And in an ideal world, we get there in a day. But there are also times where we need to back up and say, wait a minute. And this is where we were several years ago. Dyslexia doesn't exist in Michigan law. It's not recognized. So how do we change that? How do we begin to change this conversation? If we can't get the whole cake today, this is where we were, I think, about 2 years ago. If we can't get the whole cake today, how do we get that first layer or two? How do we work towards this so that these term-limited legislators with term-limited attention spans, frankly, are familiar with the actors, are familiar with the issues, and become familiar with the solutions so that we can get to that beautiful, delicious cake in a timely manner and be able to serve our students well.
Brian, you're right. Educating who you're talking to and making sure you have the different stakeholders in the process of making the sausage, right? They always say, you don't want to know how it's made and you want to eat it and grill it up. But it's so important. And it's a journey for each one of those people. If they're starting either with preconceived ideas that might be false, or if they're starting at ground zero with no knowledge. So, and it's a process, and you sometimes aren't going to end up, I know people, if we can get this legislation passed, if it isn't what we wanted, the whole cake, you pass what you can get, and then you come back and fight another day and make it better. And that's how our laws evolve anyway on just about anything. So, I agree with all the comments you made. And Brian also, the other Brian, be love.
And you might be building one layer at a time, but you can gather all of your ingredients. You can have all of those prepared and ready to go.
Yeah, in the chat, I put a shout out to Susan. I said, Susan, you educated me so that I could effectively advocate on dyslexia legislation. So thanks for carrying me along.
Thank you all. And I mentioned we're going to lift this up in the comments. And one of our resources later on is an op-ed by the same people that you see in front of you in the Detroit Free Press on why the Michigan legislature, must quickly pass these laws. We also know that the school year has just started or is starting very, very soon across the state. So we have that other level of impetus, right? Fantastic. So we've been talking about the dyslexia bills in the Michigan Senate, but let's get a little bit more specific into what that means. We've already kind of answered that first question. Why is it so important for Michigan? But what are the dyslexia bills about? What is in them, for kind of the everyday person?
I'll tackle this. I feel like that they're a part of me, and I probably have them to memory pretty well here. So Brian, clean up the work at the end if I'm not complete. There are a set of 4 bills. We have 2 Republicans and 2 Democrat senators that have that introduced those bills. We also have the same bills with just a little bit different language in the House, the same 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats. The bills do different things. Senate Bill 380 is really the largest bill. It deals with talking about valid and reliable screening so we can identify the children that are going to need the kind of support, whether they, we're looking for characteristics of dyslexia. And that doesn't mean necessarily a child has it, but it's the same, whether they do or not, we still have to support if we see deficits in word reading and decoding skills. Another aspect of that bill 380 is we're looking at expecting districts to make sure that they give teachers, administrators that decide on curriculum and assessment, speech and language people in the school psychs, that they receive training on something called structured literacy and understanding what dyslexia is. The other area, I'm trying to think, am I missing anything on 380? I think those are the 2 big ones for 380. 381 deals with, and this is such an important one, this deals with our institutions of higher learning, our teacher preparation, whether it's a university or an alternative place where teachers are trained, and they are to get that same training we talked about in 380 with structured literacy and dyslexia before they leave college or their preparation program. And 382 requires that in order to be certified or recertified as a teacher in certain grades that interface with reading instruction, that they need that training. So you're coming out of college, you've received the training, you're certified. If you're a teacher that's already in the schools, you pick up that training through the schools so that when you recertify, you can check that box. And then 383 was the bill that dealt with creating a committee that would create a dyslexia handbook. And what's interesting, the Michigan Department of Ed has just published a handbook that followed a lot of what that 383 suggests. So that's the whole package.
Thank you, Susan. And really, Susan does know these bills inside and out and better than I think anybody else in the state of Michigan, and for good reason. When I take a step back and think about the why beyond that kids should get the services they need in order to succeed, what I really think this package is about when we're focused on young literacy learners is we want to empower students by empowering parents and caregivers and teachers. And so Susan's hit the nail on the head on the vast majority of this and the really complex elements of making sure that teachers are prepared to recognize when a child is struggling and might benefit from dyslexia-focused instruction, as well as how to actually carry that forward. I think another really important piece of this is that it establishes these mandatory screenings. This isn't a whole big new thing. This is building on what already is existing and supplementing where needed to make sure that our youngest learners are screened early. We know it's far more effective for everybody involved, for children who do need additional support because of dyslexia or another learning need, to be identified as early as humanly possible. So as they're coming into the K-12 system, let's screen them as they're learning to read. Let's make sure that we're doing everything we can to identify struggling readers. There are a couple of other provisions, and two, I should say, that I think are really critical for this conversation. For kids that are a little bit older, there is a trigger so that whether you're a parent or you're a teacher or you're somebody else involved in the education of a child, if there is a concern, a suspicion, a whatever, that a child might have some of the challenges that are common with children with dyslexia, that you can initiate a screening and you can initiate it automatically. That's, I just think, so important to not take our eye off the ball as kids get a little bit older and might be out of the norm. The second thing is that parents are made a part of the process. Parents are formally made a part of the process. If your school has screened your child and said, hey, this child may have dyslexia, they may need additional or different instruction and resources, it is criminal to not have the parent know that as well. Yet today, that can be the case. You can have a school that says this child has an additional need, and for whatever reason or no reason at all, the parent is never brought into the conversation. This formalizes that structure to make sure that everybody in the state of Michigan, everybody involved in the education of children knows that's not acceptable and is not going to be accepted.
Brian, I want to piggyback on what you just said, because we know that the third grade reading law now already says that if kids are screened, that parents are sent home communication. I think what you point out is what's unique about this is we're telling districts that when you screen, look for these other indicators. Make sure they're included in your screen, because if we have word reading and decoding issues, those things need to be identified and then parents would find out. Because you're right, because that they're already told, but maybe they're not told about these are the things that we see. And the other thing in that's that 380 bill, that's like the mother lode bill. The other thing is, if we do indeed see children that are screening with these problems, you are required to use a code emphasis type of instruction. And that means you're going to teach them how to do code. You're not going to do, and it actually spells out things we should not be doing that research has show are detrimental. So, it's one thing for teachers to know what to do, but if they're not identifying the children and not applying it, and it actually will benefit all children. This isn't the instruction we're talking about is solid instruction based in research that all children should be exposed to. Our children with characteristics of dyslexia sometimes just mean more repetition, smaller groups, that kind of stuff.
I'd like to jump in on that whole point about parents and the levels of their awareness. So even before the assessment and the infamous letters go home, it's really so critical and incumbent upon educators that they are informing the families incrementally about what in fact they're seeing. I mean, we hear from parents all over, not only in the Detroit area, but across the state, that very often when they get these letters from school districts or their teachers, it's like, when did this happen? And perhaps the parent already had some suspicion, but because relationships haven't existed properly, that those things haven't happened. So I think one of the things as we talk about how do we implement, how do we have parents and educators working together as a team, we've got to emphasize more that the talking with families has to happen pre-assessment. And then not to assume that because the letter went home, that there was full comprehension of, in fact, what's being suggested. So I'd like to push the envelope just a little bit to say that with the ARPA dollars, the ESSA dollars, the huge amount of funds that are being made available to those of us both in education and parent engagement, there absolutely has to be partnerships that are helping parents get some support once they've got those letters, because we see across the board that literacy and even dyslexia amongst adults is at a high level. So we can't act like because the assessment happened and parents have gotten a letter that now they're informed and can actually be a partner in improving and supporting your child. We've got to find innovative ways to make sure that this happens structurally going forward.
And if I can add to Jametta's great comments, I had the privilege early on when I arrived at EdTrust Midwest of working with DPN on empowering and educating parents around their rights on third grade reading. And one of the things that I remember from whether it was at a DPSCD public school or at a charter school or at a church at 6 o'clock in the evening, watching those parents' eyes light up when they were given that they learned not only did they have options, but they also had rights. And right. I think that empowering parents is like empowering voters to come out and vote this November. You give them what they need, the options, the tools, and parents run with it. I remember just one quick example at Drew Middle School. I think most of that room, Jametta, was grandparents actually who are raising their grandchildren. And all of those grandparents, they turned into a mini army that day in a 1.5 hour presentation. It was powerful. And then they went out and started educating many of their family members. So it's definitely effective, definitely an important part of our issue.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much. And for a great transition to my next set of questions, which is how is this affecting Detroit, right? With Detroit's specific educational history and context, with what we have happening with maybe DPSCD and other charters, how are these bills going to impact students, teachers, schools, districts within the city of Detroit? And I think you lifted up an amazing thing, which is especially for parents and families and caregivers, this is a way for them to feel that they have an active role in their students' life and their students' education. And then as well as like civically, there's an engagement there as well. So let's talk a little bit more about some specific Detroit impacts for these bills.
If I could talk about just my experience, I don't live in Detroit. I've worked with a young child that was at Brenda Scott virtually. And I've worked with Dr. Vitti. One thing I'll say about Detroit, and Dr. Vitti has been a big supporter of this legislation, is that they've already made taken moves to use the money through the ARP money or the ESSER money, or I don't know all the names of all the little pots of money, to start teaching their teachers with something called letters training. They've done some Morton Gillingham through BrainSpring. It's starting. They're ahead of the curve. It is not you can't flip a switch on this. This is a learning journey for those teachers, and then how to actually implement it in their classrooms. And teacher shortages have had an impact on this, because you can train people to be some of the Orton Gillingham specialists, but then when classrooms don't have a teacher, sometimes people are moved around to fill the spots. So good things are starting there. I don't know the details, and Jametta, you might know more, but I know that Dr. Vitti, and he has talked about his own dyslexia and his children, that this is an important issue for him, and he's trying to make moves, but it is a slow process to get this going.
Yeah, I think there's no question that Dr. Vitti's been a leader in this area, as he has been a huge number of aspects of equity. And so have many of our charter leaders, because we cannot forget that we are in a city and in a state where, we have 20 to 35% of our children are not necessarily in a public school, but in a public charter school. The other thing I'd just like to say, when you talk about the effect of things, I am wondering, I'm kind of thinking this out loud, Brian 313 reads, we need to put some more data in front of our community. We all know and have heard that there's numbers as high as 60 to 80% of our children are not reading at grade level proficiency. We need to let our community know how significant dyslexia is in our community, so we can begin to rally around that in particular, because sometimes when people have heard this, they believe that it's a very small portion of folks, and so that it shouldn't take the level of advocacy that we have. But I think this legislation is helping to lift it up, and then also that we can begin to have, I think I want to add this, and I'll just hand it back to the educators, even though I consider myself one, is that we need more people that work with children even outside of school. Our out of school time providers, our early childhood providers, our church, our faith-based organizations, they too need to become educated in these opportunities to strengthen children in their core academic and learning, because it affects their self-confidence. And then that, of course, affects their trajectory through life. So I think our opportunity is not only in education, but also in out of school time and working with new partners, both in health and social services, to help children and families.
Really briefly, just to add, I think much of what needs to be said has already been said, and certainly Susan would agree with you. Dr. Vitti has done tremendous, he has focused tremendously on this level of identification and intervention. This legislation passing, these policies taking effect, and these policies being implemented, particularly under the leadership of someone like Dr. Vitti, who has already shown a real focus on this, I think stands to truly benefit Detroit in a disproportionately good way.
Yeah.
Following such a long period of historic disinvestment, and it does provide structures and in time resources to make sure that those investments are really able to do the transformational work that they should be doing already. The other thing I would just note is that our focus on this legislation should absolutely be around the kids that it's first intended to affect. The kids who have dyslexia that are not currently identified and therefore will benefit following an initial identification for characteristics of dyslexia, a full evaluation, and the types of supports that really are going to help them succeed. What I think we sometimes lose in this, though, is that there's also an entirely significantly larger universe of kids. That's research often puts it at about 1 in 5. There's a whole other universe of kids that don't have dyslexia, but do exhibit some of the characteristics of dyslexia. There's a whole universe of kids that aren't ever going to receive a dyslexia diagnosis, but will benefit tremendously from the interventions and teaching strategies that also benefit kids that do have dyslexia. This is about improving early literacy across the board, as well as for students who, you fast forward 4 steps down the road, end up with a diagnosis. And I don't want to lose sight that both within Detroit and within Michigan as a whole, we have done a terrible job when it comes to early literacy. This is an important step to putting in place the structures and the resources and the interventions to actually make children to make children whole, to add up to what the punitive measures in other legislation have forced down. This is about supporting kids for reading.
I just want to pop in really quickly. Elise put a really interesting question in the chat, and I want to lift it up, especially because I know that Detroit Parent Network, partnering with EdTrust Midwest, is doing some really interesting work in this area. Jametta, could you respond to Elise's question that I put down there?
Sure. Pardon me, I'm working on my cell phone, so I've got to expand the view and all of that. I think when we talk about coffee chat, so one of the things that B-Love brought up, Brian Love, is that, yes, we have been doing workshops, and we call them healthy family cafes. And to be a healthy family, you also have to be literate. So one of the things that we're excited about doing is in our work, particularly through our faith-based partners, our educational and health partners, is having more of these healthy family cafes in which we will continue to talk about what are the building blocks within the family and around language for early literacy. And dyslexia is part of that. And with this legislation, I'm really pleased to say that we'll also be training up our parents so they can be part of the army that's necessary to make sure that it's being implemented. But I do want to let you know that we're continuing our healthy family cafes and the building blocks of early literacy, both from an educational framework as well as a health framework, are certainly part of that. And we would welcome any partners that are part of this space to reach out to us, because we're more than willing to do these not only online, but as we did with EdTrust, we will go to a Boys and Girls Club. We will go to a faith-based organization to have these conversations. And we're saying to schools, we're saying to Dr. Vitti, we're saying to Ralph Bland, Danielle Jackson, all of the leaders, that we are a resource that's happy to come and speak with your parents in these what we call healthy family cafes to have these kind of conversations. Thank you for the opportunity to share that.
That's excellent. So we have to make sure that I want to make sure that the expectations of these bills is grounded in what the bills say. I don't want anybody to come away with anything that's confusing. These bills do not, I'm going to make sure that you know this, they do not identify a child as dyslexic. That is not what these bills do. These bills are looking to screen and to intervene with children that are showing characteristics of dyslexia. So we know research says 7 to 20% of the population is dyslexic. There's quite a range there that people will argue about. But the bottom line is this: as a special ed teacher, whether my student is gone out and gotten a very expensive evaluation that says I'm dyslexic, or I have another student in my class who shows characteristics of dyslexia and has trouble spelling, has trouble decoding, all this, I'm still going to be using evidence-based strategies with that student in the way I instruct them. So that's what these bills are about. It's just really important that, we have all the pieces fit together to make that happen, with the teachers knowing what to do. We identify the children, etc. Now, if a child doesn't respond to what's going on in the general ed, and we're doing the right kind of instruction, and with tier 2, a little more intensive, then what you might see is they will step into the world of IDEA, where they go through a more comprehensive evaluation. School psychologists, you will not usually see will say this child is dyslexic. What they usually put it under is a specific reading disability. It just so happens, the history was dyslexia was supposedly a medical term and nobody would use it. But they don't, sometimes you won't see it used very much in schools. I don't agree with that because we know the federal law says you can use it. But that might happen that they're going to go through that route. But we're trying to find the children early enough and intervene so that those children don't end up on an IEP. And, that isn't the route that they take. Some children might still, because they're going to need way more intensive help.
If I can go back to the question about Detroit, very impressed with what DPSCD and Dr. Vitti is doing, particularly because they're approaching it two-pronged. They're working on the short term, the issue here and now, but also looking down the road as you continue to deal with this issue. Because as a point that Susan made at the beginning, at the top of this conversation, this is not something that's going to be solved overnight this year. It's a long, intensive work with collaboration and lifting of our voices out of the community. That's why, all the panelists, we all know each other very well. We work together. I think we've come to even know each other personally. Susan's turned me into a Memphis Grizzly basketball fan, which I never thought would happen. So, we spent a lot of time together because we work diligently on this issue with a host of other folks. And so I think that's how we, to Brian Gutman's point, not just in Detroit, but across the state, collectively raising our voices and collaborating and really bringing in the folks who are mostly affected by this as part of the conversation, but also the solution is how we really try to put a dent in this issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd like to add quickly that I think two other words kind of came up in our discussion that are important. One is the word assessment. Because so often we don't talk about how assessment is the first step to better understand what in fact are we seeing, what might be the appropriate interventions. So I think our opportunity is to educate parents in particular and push our educators that assessing is really critical, and it's not anything to be afraid of. It's not the test. It's not punitive. It is something that helps us to understand something more so that we can have a better intervention. And I think Brian G., you lifted up the fact that this is really about improving strategies specifically for all kids' early literacy. And I think that's another important piece that we can all rally around, because sometimes people we get locked into our silos. Well, why should we do that? Because that's for those children. That doesn't affect my child or most of my kids. No, these are things that are fundamental to help improve strategies and funding and support to educators and support to parents so that all of our children can thrive. And obviously literacy is such a critical part of that.
Absolutely. What an amazing discussion. I do want to go back really quickly. Susan, there was a question to your comment of schools being reluctant to use the term dyslexia, especially on something, like an IEP, that kind of thing. Why are schools so reluctant to use that term?
Well, I'll go back. I'll never forget. I was in an IEP in Lansing. It was probably 1996 or 7. And, like 2000, because I had been trained at the Michigan Dyslexia Institute. And I remember saying to a parent, we might want to see if I'm seeing some things that look like dyslexia, and I'm thinking maybe he could get some help this summer at this place. And my supervisor pulled me over after the meeting and says, do not bring up that word. And then they said, that's a medical diagnosis. So that's sort of where it started. But then what we see over time is there have been directions from the feds through IDEA that say, no, absolutely, you can use that term. But that holdover, you'll still hear principals and administrators and all kinds of people in the world of education say, oh, medical diagnosis, don't touch it. So, because as soon as you write it in an IEP, you're required to address it, which means you need to know people that know about dyslexia. So it's usually put in under specific reading disability.
And this entire discussion, which does get complex and sometimes head spinning, is one of the reasons why Michigan, including in this year's budget, has included a definition of dyslexia in state law. And that's been one of the fights over the years. How do we literally write the term into state law and then define it to take away all of these arguments for can we use it, can we not use it? It exists in state law today, and that's a really important change. And this all has come about in the last 5 or so years. And that's before we get to doing anything about it.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much. We've put it up on the screen before, but our last dyslexia series session was all about screening and identification and the complexities of that and what that means and all of that stuff. So if you're really invigorated by this discussion, please go check that out on our Facebook page as well. Would love to wrap this up. I know we've been going for a full hour and I don't want to take too much of the rest of our discussants' day. So we would love to know, in kind of a really quick wrap around right before we get into our book raffle, what is one takeaway that each of you, the discussants, have for one of our audience members? One thing that you would like our audience to take away from the bills, possibly some civic engagement related to these bills, or anything else about dyslexia policy that you would like everyone to know?
I would say know that your voice matters, and that there are other voices out there that matter just as much, and collectively your voices can make a difference.
I would add that parents, as always, are essential, and just as essential as parents is not only engaging their educators for how to support their child, but also their pediatrician. So the more that we have a comprehensive support for the whole child, then I think we're going to see things improve, whether we're working on policy or programs.
I would just say if this were easy, it would already be done. So please reach out to your representatives and tell them that this matters. I think the link was provided before to the website that's really all about these bills and has advocacy tools there. But please, please, please make your support known and tell your elected officials that this is critical. It's currently in the Michigan House of Representatives.
And I'm going to piggyback on that call to action. We know that the bills are in the Education Committee in the House, and we are running out of time. Let's be real about this. They're not going to be in session very many more times before the election, November 8th. And when we come back November 8th, it will be fast and furious through a lame duck session. And so your voice, you can go on our website, the mydyslexialaws.com, and find out who is chair of the Education Committee in the House. Find out who is the Speaker of the House, Jason Wentworth. Communicate with them. Tell them the importance of getting those bills out to the House floor and voting on these. And let's get them to the governor's desk to sign them into law.
Absolutely. Piggybacking off of that, if we can share the resources screen. So we have linked the previous dyslexia series sessions. We've linked multiple news articles, some of whom are written by the discussants that you've heard today about these bills and the importance and need for them. We also have a list of interactive websites where you can figure out who your Michigan senator is and who your representative is. And on Michigan Dyslexia Laws, they have a template that you can use to send that email to your representative so that, just like Susan said, we can really get this moving. We will definitely add to this to make sure that all of the links that we have shared today will be added to this PDF that will then be uploaded onto 313reads.org/resources. And finally, without any delay, let's go ahead and figure out who has won a free copy of our book. So I have everyone's name from the registration right in here. I'm going to go ahead and spin. I'm sharing it with you all so you know that I'm not cheating, picking any favorites. Our winner is Shelly Schultz. Shelly, thank you so much. Expect an email from me asking for your mailing address. Thank you so, so much. All right. Well, thank you again. Thank you to all of our discussants for taking the time out of your day today to talk to us about the Michigan dyslexia laws. We really appreciate this time, and we really appreciate you and all of your advocacy for students and children in Michigan. So thank you so much, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye.
And thank you, fellow equity warriors. We need you. Thank you.